In this How-To-Svelte, we'll be completing an audio player that we started in part 1, so this is part 2. And in part 1, this is what we finished, a heading with some basic controls and a volume slider. And in part 2, what we'll be doing is adding a progress bar as well as a playlist. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, you can go to my YouTube channel and look for How-To-Svelte Audio Player Part 1. So to get started, let's take a look at this audio file variable that we created that is an instantiation of the audio object. In order for us to understand how we can do a progress bar and add the time and duration of the audio file, we have to look at this audio object. And if we come over to W3 Schools, if we come here and take a look at some of its methods, properties, and at the bottom there should be some events here. And we'll take a look at this one event called loadedmetadata. Fires when the browser has loaded metadata for the audio or video file. And so if we click on that, we can use an event listener on loaded metadata. So let's go ahead and copy that and bring it over. And just underneath the track title, we'll do audio file and then add this event listener, in which we can then use a callback function. And on the callback function, what we'll do is we'll console log audio file dot duration. There's a duration property, returns the length of the current audio or video file in seconds. So on loaded metadata, let's see if it's down here. Yep, and it comes back. Now without this, if we just try to console log this without using this event listener, let's see what happens. See, we get not a number, and we just have to wait for the metadata to load before that duration information is available. So that's why we tuck it into this event listener called onLoadedMetadata. So after it has loaded, it then calls this function to console log the duration property for this audio file that we created here. So now that we have that property, we need to do something with it. So let's go ahead and make a variable, and this will be for the track duration. We'll call this total track time. And so once the duration property comes in, we'll set total track time to audiofile.duration. Okay, so now that we know that that's coming in, let's go ahead and add some HTML and CSS for this progress bar. And we'll add that just below the track heading. And then I'll add some CSS. And so now you can see the 0 we have set up for this span tag is showing up. And for track duration, we'll just, for right now, use total track time, which doesn't make sense in the end, but we'll just get something to show up. And you can see we get 9,375, and that's seconds. In fact, I'm going to put that here. So this is in seconds. Now, to display the time correctly, since we're starting with seconds, we're going to have to add some variables and a function that will help take this large number and parse it into something that is usable for a display. So let's go ahead and set up some other variables, and we'll call this so we have total time display, which is what we'll show over here once we parse this. And then the current time display will be this right here. Now we've hard-coded the zeros in, but this will be a live number once we get some more functionality. So now let's go ahead and build a function that will do something with this total track time. Now what we're going to deal with first in update time is we're going to deal with the duration. And so that's the total time displayed. That's basically what's over here, the duration of the track. And so I've got some code here that will basically take the total track time and do a little bit of math on it in order to make a new variable called duration for hours, duration for minutes, and duration for seconds. What we'll want to do next is put it in a string format so that we can display it up here. And so I take total time display, which I created here, and now I'm taking these values and I'm using some string interpolation. That's what the backticks and the $ and curly braces are. And so now this is creating a string that we can then show on the DOM. So now we'll take total time display, come down here, and this span tag is right here. We'll take total track time and put total time display. Now it shows undefined right now because we haven't called our function yet. And so where we're going to want to call this function, this update time function, is right here. When the audio file on loaded metadata has got what it needs and total track time has what it needs, then we'll go ahead and call this function update time. And as soon as we do that, you can see that it updates immediately. So now that we've got the total time display showing correctly, let's go ahead and bring in the progress bar itself. We'll add the HTML and CSS for that. And so here's our progress bar, and we can't see anything happening in there yet, because if we look down at this rule for the span tag with the ID bar, it has no content in there, and it also has no width. But as soon as I give it some width, you can see that it now moves over. So as I change these values, you can see it's slowly going across the screen. So we'll go back to 0 again. And if you haven't seen my video on how to svelte progress bar, I suggest you take a look at that, and it'll make sense a little bit more what we're going to be doing. It's the same idea. We're going to take the width value for the style property, and we're going to use this Svelte syntax here, and we're going to put a value in there, which we'll call progress. Now progress we'll take up here to the top, and we'll go ahead and initialize this variable to 0. But you can see if I change it to 30, it does the same thing we just did, because we're passing this variable into the width property here, which is now representing a percentage. This is taking the initial rule, which was set at 0%, and adding 30 to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to control this variable, the value of this variable, and we're going to connect it to the audio. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to come to our update time function, and we're going to set progress so the current time property, if we go back to our W3 schools here, you can see it's a property here. It sets or returns the current playback position. So we basically want to get the current play position at any given second or half second, and we'll set that up. We want to get the current time, and then with a little bit of math, it will help set the value for progress. And once the value for progress is set, that will control how much of this width is shown of the span tag. And the span tag in this case will be yellow, so we'll know when it goes across. And so the next thing we want to set up is this other variable, current time display. So we've set up the functionality for the total time display, but now let's go ahead and add some rules for the current time. So again, each time we get the current time of the audio file, we're going to do a little bit of math in order to clean it up so that we can then show it on the web page. And then we'll use this line where we set current time display, where we use some string interpolation to then take these values and make it presentable here. So now that we've set current time display, we can take out this 000 hard coding and replace it with some Svelte curly braces and put current time display in. So now the current time display is showing 0:0:0, and generally we want time to be double digits, so we're going to add a few other rules here too. And this will apply to the current time as well as the total duration. So we'll just have some conditionals so that if any of these numbers are less than 10, then go ahead and use string interpolation, add a 0 in front of the single digit, which in this case will be 0 through 9. So as soon as we add these conditionals, look, the time changes now. And the only one we're not worried about is hours, because it's probably very rare that we'll have a file that will be more than 9 hours long. The next thing we want to do is we need to call this function on a regular basis. And so, again, if you checked out this video on ProgressBar, you'll see the similarity here. We're also going to set up a set interval. In fact, we can kind of just do it right off the bat, and it should work. And what we'll do is we'll call update time, and we'll do it every 1/10 of a second. So right now, behind the scenes, this is firing. So as soon as I hit play, you can see that the current time display is constantly updating. And that's because this function is being called 1/10 of every second. Now, we don't want to have this out in the open like this because at some point we're also going to want to clear this interval. So let's add another variable, and we'll call it track timer. And we'll set up another function called toggle time running. And in this function, we want to basically look at the audio file's property called ended. If we come back to here, you can see there's a property called ended and returns whether the playback of the audio has ended or not. And if the property coming back is true, if the ended property coming back is true, then we want to clear interval. What are we going to clear? Well, this variable we just made up here called track timer, we're going to put this down here in the else part. And we're going to assign track timer to the set interval. And so set interval is assigned to track timer. So now we can use clear interval with track timer as the argument to stop the timer. So now that we have this function, we have to figure out where to call it. And we probably want to call it when the play button is clicked. So let's come down here where we made our play pause audio function, and we'll call that immediately. So now let's test this out. Looks like it's working fine, and I can see the progress bar. In fact, let me go ahead and hit the forward arrow a few times. So the forward arrow is moving the audio 10 seconds forward, so you can see the progress bar slowly moving along. So we've got basically the duration of the audio file. We've got a count up called current time display, and we got a progress bar to show how much audio has been played already. So let's go ahead and take what we've done, and we'll move this over to a component. We'll call this component TrackBarTime. Now, if we come down to the HTML, all of this right now is representing the ProgressBarTime component. So let's just cut this out. And we'll put it right below track heading where we had it before. And then we'll also need to move this CSS that we made from time down to bar. So as you can see, we've got a few props that we need to pass. So let's go ahead and export those. And then over inside app, all the error messages have gone away. I can see the duration time. I can see the current time. Let's go ahead and test this out.
Pariyati Audiobooks presents Dana, the practice, the teaching disquality minds of his listeners.
Good, and I can see the progress bar moving, the times incrementing. If I go back, the times decrementing. So it looks like everything's working fine. And so the last part we want to add is the playlist. And you can see it's an accordion. You can check out my other video, How-To-Svelte Accordion Collapsibles. This is using the exact same concept where we have a button with a div, and when the button's clicked, it extends the height of the div, and when it's clicked again, it reduces the height down to 0. And so to add the playlist, let's go down to our HTML, and just below this section tag, now let me go ahead and add some CSS. Good, so we have our initial playlist, and it doesn't work yet. We've got a button, which is this, and then a UL, which is hidden. Now let's take a look at the UL. You can see it has a height of 0, but if I were to do 100 pixels, you can see it opens up here. So this is the property that we're going to be toggling. Now there is a class here called showList, and this is the one that will actually take the height and add 150 pixels. So that's what we're going to use on the UL tag. So we'll set up a class, add this class showList when whatever goes in here evaluates to true. So I think what we'll do is we'll set up a variable and we'll call it list is showing. Set it to false. And so when list is showing as true, this UL tag will show. So let's come up here and just set it to true. And if I do that, it opens up. Set it back to false. Now this right here is a button. So let's go ahead and put our on click on that. And the on click basically wants to toggle this value here. So let's set up a function that we'll call show playlist. And its job is to just toggle this value list is showing. So we'll assign it to the opposite of whatever the current value is. So it's currently false. And if we put this event handler on the button, when the button's clicked, it will toggle that value and it opens the list. Click it again, it closes it. Now there's one other class here, and you can see we get a warning here that there's a button active class. Here it is. So we want to add that class to the button when list is showing as true. So now when I click it, it's true, so that adds that class, which decorates the background differently and what have you. If I click it again, list is showing becomes false, and then that class gets removed. Now let's deal with the track list itself, the playlist itself. So we have one value hard-coded in there right now using track title. But what we really want to use are the entries that we have in our array here. We've got 3 of them. And this is known as audio data, which we've exported and we've imported up here at the top. So let's come down here and we'll make a svelte each loop. And I'm going to destructure what we have in here. So it's name and URL. Instead of track title now, we will do name. And let's see what that did. So good, now we've got all three showing up. Now, the way we're going to have this work is we're going to set up an on-click on each of these LI tags so that when it gets clicked, it loads the track, it'll load the time, and then we could play the track. So on our LI tag, let's set up an on-click, and we'll call a function handled track. We'll come up here and define that. And so what we want to have happen is we want to have each of these tracks have a distinguishable ID to them. And so we could set up an ID for each LI tag, but instead I think what I'm going to do is set up a data attribute instead. And that data attribute, I'll give the name track ID. For the each loop, there's always an index counter here. So I'll make use of that, and I'll set the data track ID to that counter. So now when we do that, let's just check out what that looks like. So now you can see the first track has a track ID of 0, the second track ID of 1, track ID of 2. So when the LI tag is clicked in handle track, we'll use the event object and we'll console log. Actually, we'll console dir e.target. Let's open up DevTools again. And so when I click on a track and then open up the object here, you can see that we have a property here called dataset. And this is exactly the data attribute that we just set up here. And if I open up dataset, you can see it's got one property, track ID. Well, that's because I set it up with track-ID. Now, in the object here, it's camel-cased, so we're going to need to do that. So this is our guide here. If I go back up to the function, it's e.target.dataset.trackID. So now if I hit Lumbini, what comes back is 1 because that's its track ID. There's 0 and there's 2. Perfect. So now we can make use of this dataset attribute coming in for each track. So why would we want to capture 0, 1, 2? Because if we come back up to the top here, we can see that what we've been deciding to be the track is this track index. Right now it's set to 0. So what we'll do is for this function, handle track, is instead of console logging it, we'll set track index to be e.target.dataset.trackID. Now, the other thing we need to do is once we have that index number is we need to feed it into the instantiation of the audio object. And so one thing we can do is, since this is going to be a regular routine, we'll take this and we'll make a new function, load track. And so as soon as load track is called, it will immediately instantiate a new audio object with this new index to get the audio file of our array. And then the next thing we need to do is this part right here where we load the metadata. So let's take that and we'll also put it inside the function. And the last thing we need to do is make sure that the title gets loaded as well. Remember, when we click on a track, we're actually setting track index to a new number. And when that happens, then we need to instantiate a new audio object to get the new URL. And we also need to grab the name property from each of these objects so that it loads the top bar correctly. And load track, when are we going to call that? Well, if we come back down here to our handle track, let's call it right here. So let's just try this. Let's test this out. So I click on Lumbini. The track loads, the new time loads, and I'll go ahead and play the file.
Lumbini.
Good. So we got it to work but there's a little bit of conditional handling that we're going to have to add to this function because it's a little too unpredictable. For example, I could click on a lot of these files and they all play at the same time, but we don't want that to happen. So let's set up a condition that if, remember we made this Boolean called isPlaying right here. So if isPlaying is false, then let's do what we just did. Else, if isPlaying is true, if it's actually happening, then let's set isPlaying to false. Let's immediately take the audio file and pause it. And then we'll do exactly what we did right here, which was get the new track, set the new track index, and also call the load track function. So let's try that. So right now there isn't any audio playing, so this one should be happening.
Pariyati Audiobooks presents Dana,
Now I'll click this one.
the practice of...
And it immediately paused the audio file. It loaded the new track, and now it's ready to go. Now I can click play for the second track.
Lumbini.
Good. So we got that working. Now, I don't know about you, but mostly a playlist, when I click on a track, it usually auto plays. So why don't we make use of the function we already created called play pause audio, and we'll just call that immediately. As soon as the track is clicked, we'll call play pause audio. So we'll play.
Pariyati
Great compassion. During the entire 7 weeks,
Lumbini.
Good. So we got handle track working just fine. The other thing we want to handle on the update time function is we want to deal with a situation where the audio has come to the end and it has literally ended itself. So, and that's a property that you can see here. Here it is, end it. Returns whether the playback of the audio has ended or not. So if it has ended, then let's go ahead and call this toggle timing, because we want to stop that set interval function that is constantly updating the time. We're currently calling toggle time running inside of our play pause audio. You see we're calling it there and we're calling it there. But while the audio is playing, once it gets to the end, we need to just be able to cancel out this set interval some way. So we'll do that inside this update time function. If that's the case, if it's going to get called here, we also need to make sure that isPlaying is equal to false. And why don't we just set up a console log here that will say that the audio file has ended. So if we come here and do our second track, which is only 4 seconds long, let's try that.
Lumbini.
And right when it gets to the end, you can see our console message just showed. And so that means also it indicates to us that this set interval has now been cleared and it's no longer running behind the scenes. Now, one of the other things we want to deal with is if I go ahead and refresh this page, take a look at these time areas, you'll see the word undefined showing there. You see undefined? So instead of that, let's go ahead and just hard code in a value at the very beginning. And so the total time display, we can set that to loading. You see how it's loading? Yeah, there it is. And then the current time, we'll just hard code that to be the same 0:00:00. Now, these two strings will be replaced eventually if we look back down in update time. You remember, these are going to get replaced with, after the calculations happen, these will get updated with the current hours, minutes, and seconds. And that's a basic audio player using Svelte.